Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and every day I get to share a piece of history that I think you'll find as fascinating as I do. Today we're heading to the Standing Rock Reservation in South Dakota on December 15th, 1890. And I need to tell you up front, this is a painful story about injustice and tragedy. It's about the morning Sitting Bull, the legendary Lakota leader who defeated Custer at the Little Bighorn, was killed during an arrest attempt by Indian police. Native officers working for the U.S. government. And here's what troubles me most about this moment. Sitting Bull was killed by his own people, men who'd been placed in an impossible position by a government that had systematically destroyed their way of life. Understanding what happened that morning and why forces us to confront how systems of oppression don't just attack people directly, but turn communities against themselves. This is a story about resistance, about tragedy, and about what happens when you can't win, no matter what choice you make. Picture this. It's just before dawn on December 15th, 1890, on the Standing Rock Reservation. A group of Indian police, Lakota men working for the Indian agent, surround Sitting Bull's cabin. They have orders to arrest him. The government is worried about the ghost dance movement, a spiritual revival sweeping through reservations. They believe Sitting Bull might leave the reservation to join the ghost dancers, possibly sparking what they fear could become an uprising. The police enter the cabin. They wake Sitting Bull and tell him he's under arrest. He's 59 years old, a man who once led thousands of warriors, now living in a small cabin under government surveillance. He agrees to go with them. They start to walk him outside, but his followers have gathered. Over 100 Lakota people surround the police, angry, tense. Sitting Bull hesitates. The crowd calls for him to resist. The situation becomes increasingly volatile. Then someone, the evidence isn't entirely clear who, fires a shot. In the chaos that follows, a gun battle erupts. Sitting Bull is shot in the chest and head. He dies almost instantly, along with his son Crowfoot, 6 of his followers, and 6 Indian police officers. Here's the thing that I always wonder about. What was going through the minds of those Indian police officers? They were Lakota men, members of Sitting Bull's own nation. They were arresting and ultimately killing a man who represented everything they'd lost. They were doing it at the orders of the government that had conquered them all. What does that do to you? What does it mean to survive by becoming an instrument of your own people's oppression? Let me build the clock for you, because understanding how we got to that morning, how a legendary leader ended up killed by his own people, requires examining the machinery of cultural destruction and how systems of oppression work by dividing those they oppress. Think about it this way. Sitting Bull had been a symbol of resistance for decades. In 1876, at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, he'd helped orchestrate the defeat of Custer's 7th Cavalry, one of the U.S. Army's worst defeats in the Indian Wars. That victory didn't stop the U.S. expansion, but it became legendary. Sitting Bull became famous, a leader who refused to surrender his people's way of life. Here's what the evidence tells us. After the Little Bighorn, the U.S. Army pursued the Lakota relentlessly. Sitting Bull fled to Canada, but eventually returned and surrendered in 1881. He was imprisoned for 2 years, then sent to Standing Rock Reservation, where he lived under constant government surveillance. His movements were restricted, his influence was monitored, The government wanted him contained, but they couldn't completely silence him. Sitting Bull opposed land deals that would break up the reservation. He opposed assimilation policies. He represented traditional ways and resistance to government control, and by 1890, he'd become associated with the ghost dance movement. Think about what the ghost dance meant. It was a spiritual movement that promised the restoration of the old ways, the return of the buffalo, the disappearance of white settlers, the revival of traditional life. It was peaceful, religious, desperate, a people's dream of redemption when everything had been taken from them. But the U.S. government saw it as dangerous. They saw large gatherings of Indians dancing, talking about change, holding on to hope. They feared an uprising. They wanted it stopped. And they wanted Sitting Bull, still influential, still resistant, removed from the reservation. Here's where the machinery becomes crucial. The government couldn't just send the army to arrest Sitting Bull. That would look too much like what it was, military force against a civilian. So they used the Indian police, a force of native men employed by the government to maintain order on reservations. I find myself thinking about the position those Indian police were in. They were men trying to survive in a system designed to destroy their culture. They'd taken government jobs because there were no other jobs. The buffalo were gone. Traditional ways of life were illegal. The reservation system kept them dependent and controlled. Being an Indian police officer meant a salary, rations, and a measure of status in the new order. But it also meant enforcing the government's will against your own people. It meant arresting people for practicing their religion, for leaving the reservation, for resisting policies you might not agree with yourself. It meant that on a cold December morning, you might have to arrest a man who represented everything you'd lost. And when things went wrong, you might have to kill him. Now, here's what the investigator in me sees when I look at what happened that morning. The evidence shows multiple failures, multiple decisions that made tragedy likely. The government ordered the arrest based on fear and speculation, not on any actual crime that Sitting Bull had committed. The decision to use Indian police instead of Army troops put Native officers in an impossible position. The timing, early morning when followers would be nearby, created conditions for confrontation. The lack of clear de-escalation plans meant that when tension rose, violence became almost inevitable. But here's what really troubles me. This wasn't an accident. This was the system working as designed. The government had systematically destroyed Lakota society, killed the buffalo to eliminate their food source, forced them onto reservations, outlawed their religious practices, took their children to boarding schools, and made traditional life impossible. Then they employed some Lakota people as police to control other Lakota people, creating divisions within the community, making survival dependent on complicity with oppression. Think about what that does to a society. An external enemy is not just attacking you. You're being turned against each other. The people arresting you are your own relatives, members of your own nation, forced by circumstances to choose between starving and becoming instruments of government control. We're still seeing versions of this pattern today, and I think this is where the story gets especially relevant for us right now. Look at how systems of oppression work. They don't just attack directly. They create conditions where oppressed people have to participate in their own oppression to survive. They create impossible choices where there are no good options. Here's what fascinates me. The pattern of using community members as police in oppressed communities. That pattern continues. When majority black neighborhoods have predominantly black police forces, and those officers have to enforce laws that disproportionately target their own communities. That's a version of the Indian police dilemma. when immigration enforcement recruits people from immigrant communities, when communities police themselves on behalf of systems that oppress them, the machinery is similar. Think about it. The Indian police at Standing Rock weren't the real problem. They were symptoms of a larger system. They were men making impossible choices in conditions they didn't create and couldn't control, but they became the instruments through which Sitting Bull died. They had to live with that, and their community had to live with the division it created. The pattern repeats in different forms. Systems of oppression create conditions where survival requires complicity, where you can starve or you can take the job that makes you part of the system oppressing your community, where you can resist and be destroyed or cooperate and betray your values. There are no good choices, only different kinds of loss. Here's what troubles me. We judge the people making these impossible choices. The Indian police who killed Sitting Bull, the community members who become police in neighborhoods they're from, without fully reckoning with the systems that create these impossible positions. We focus on individual actors, while the machinery that makes these tragedies continues operating. I find myself thinking about this a lot, because as someone who worked in law enforcement, I understand the complexity. Police officers, regardless of their background, are put in positions where they must enforce laws they may disagree with, make split-second decisions in impossible circumstances, and serve as the visible face of systems they don't control. But that doesn't excuse systems that deliberately create these conflicts. The government that employed Indian police knew what it was doing, creating a native force to control Native people, driving wedges within communities, making resistance harder because it meant fighting your own relatives. 2 weeks after Sitting Bull's death, the U.S. Army massacred over 250 Lakota people at Wounded Knee, men, women, children. That massacre is usually remembered as the end of the Indian Wars. But it started with the Ghost Dance Panic, the same fear that led to Sitting Bull's death. The tragedy at Standing Rock was a precursor to an even greater tragedy. And here's what the evidence shows. None of this was necessary. The Ghost Dance wasn't a military threat. Sitting Bull wasn't planning an uprising. The fears were manufactured or exaggerated. But those manufactured fears led to real deaths, real trauma, absolute destruction. So as we think about that cold December morning in 1890, when Sitting Bull died outside his cabin on Standing Rock Reservation, I believe the question for us isn't just about what happened. The question is about systems that create impossible choices and the ongoing legacy of those systems. I respect the humanity of everyone involved in that tragedy. Sitting Bull, who resisted until the end, represented a way of life that was being destroyed. The Indian police, trapped between survival and complicity, are forced to make an impossible choice. The followers who gathered that morning, desperate to protect a leader who'd protected them. Even the government officials who genuinely feared an uprising. They were wrong, but they weren't necessarily malicious. But here's what the investigator in me sees. Good people trapped in a bad system still produce tragic outcomes. The Indian police weren't villains. They were men in an impossible position. But Sitting Bull is still dead. The system that created that impossible position is the real problem. Think about what happened to the Lakota people, to all Native peoples in what became the United States. Systematic destruction of their way of life, broken treaties, forced relocations, cultural genocide, and when they'd been pushed to the brink, when they turned to spiritual movements like the Ghost Dance for hope, that was seen as threatening too. Sitting Bull's death is part of that larger story. It's not an isolated tragedy. It's one moment in the systematic destruction of indigenous peoples and cultures. And understanding it requires understanding not just what happened that morning, but everything that led to it. I always come back to this principle. Respect every person for who they are. That means respecting Sitting Bull's resistance, his refusal to surrender his culture and values. It means respecting the impossible position the Indian police were in. It means recognizing that systems of oppression don't just hurt people. They corrupt relationships, divide communities, and force people into positions where they have to choose between survival and values. Here's what gives me some small hope. We're finally starting to reckon with this history. Native American history is being taught more honestly. Treaties are being honored more often, though still not consistently. Indigenous voices are being heard more, though still not enough. The machinery that created Standing Rock and Wounded Knee is being challenged, though it still operates in many ways. But here's what troubles me. The legacy continues. Native Americans still face systemic disadvantages: poverty, health disparities, missing and murdered Indigenous women, ongoing threats to sovereignty and land rights. The system that killed Sitting Bull was never fully dismantled. It just evolved. The great philosopher George Santayana once wrote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And here's why that matters today. Sitting Bull's death teaches us how systems of oppression work, not just through direct violence, but by creating impossible choices, by turning communities against themselves, by making survival require complicity. Yet we keep seeing this pattern. Police forces drawn from oppressed communities used to control those communities. These economic systems force people to participate in their own exploitation, and political systems that divide marginalized groups against each other. If we cannot remember how the government used Indian police to kill Sitting Bull, not because those officers were evil, but because the system gave them no good choices, we're condemned to keep creating these divisions, these impossible positions, these tragedies where oppressed people become instruments of their own oppression. The question isn't about individual choices made in impossible circumstances. The question is about why we keep creating systems that force impossible choices. I'm Richard Backus, and this is the Daily History Chronicle. Tomorrow, we'll explore another moment that shaped our world. Until then, think about systems that create impossible choices, about how oppression divides communities against themselves, and about whether we're building a world where people don't have to choose between survival and values. Because that's what Sitting Bull's death teaches us. Not just about one tragic morning, but about the machinery of oppression and our ongoing responsibility to dismantle it. Thank you for your time. If you enjoyed this episode, then please subscribe. If you really enjoyed it, then please tell a friend. I hope you will join me again tomorrow for more of our shared history.